Hi everybody. Today we're going to discuss René Descartes, Meditations on First Philosophy. This is a text that you're probably going to get in a lot of intro to philosophy classes. And what I have on the board here is what I take to be Descartes' sort of mission here. He wants to establish a firm foundation for science. And I think it's useful to construe science broadly. The Latin is scientia, and it means truth. And so really Descartes is interested in figuring out a way to have knowledge that's just as firm about the world as we have about things like mathematics. So that's his goal. But what does he mean by first philosophy? Well, when he says first philosophy, what he's really advocating is sort of tearing down the foundations of everything we think we know. Because of course, we think we know lots of things that we don't actually know. Tearing down those foundations and starting from something fresh, something that we're sure about. Okay, so you're engaging in sort of your first philosophical exploration of, in this case, truth, what we actually know. And so in Meditation 1, Descartes starts talking about reasons that he has for doubting things. So, for instance, he says, it could very well be that I'm mad. I'm insane. There are certainly insane people who think they know things that actually are not true. I think I'm an emperor. I think I'm wearing clothes when in fact I'm running around stark naked. And so we have that reason for doubt, madness. And another form of madness that gets mentioned later in the Meditations is the notion of having feelings or sensations of things that aren't really there. So hallucinations would count as madness. People who have had amputated limbs often have feelings of pain from those limbs which are not there. And so you could consider that a form of madness in a sense. Another reason for doubt is dreaming. Descartes says, well, now sure, when we're done dreaming, we usually realize that it was a dream. But while we're in the midst of the dream, frequently, we have no basis for drawing that conclusion. And I'm sure you've had dreams that are very upsetting or very intense, and they feel very real. And yes, you realize it's a dream after you're done, but while you're dreaming, you really have no reason to think this isn't reality. And so if that's the case, how do I know that I'm not dreaming? Maybe I'm dreaming about making this video right now. And certainly I've had dreams where I've been in locations that I've actually been in my waking life. So can I really be certain? All right. But the third and most sort of damning reason for doubt is what he calls deceiver doubt. What if there is a malevolent deceiver with godlike powers who is fixing it so that every time I come to a conclusion about something, I'm incorrect, even if it's something as simple as adding 2 plus 2, and each time I do it, 2 plus 2 equals 5, 2 plus 2 equals 5. Well, if there is a deceiver with the powers of a god, it's not unreasonable to think that such a powerful being could make it so that I constantly make that mistake. 2 plus 2 equals 5. And so you can see, if our goal is to create a first philosophy and our goal is to establish a firm foundation for knowledge, these three forms of doubt make it very difficult, especially deceiver doubt. And so in the next meditation, Meditation 2, Descartes tries to start from a new firm point that can't be doubted. Okay? He calls this an Archimedean point. And what he means by that is, he's referring to a Greek scientist, Archimedes, who did some of the first writing and experimenting with levers and pulleys and sort of mechanical labor. And Archimedes said that if you had a firm enough point, a firm enough fulcrum for your lever, in principle, there's no reason why you couldn't lift the entire Earth. So here's the Earth here. I won't bother to fill in all the details. But you can see in principle that that is true. If you had a fulcrum that was strong enough and a lever that was strong enough and you had enough strength, there's no reason in principle why you could not move something that large. And so the metaphor here is that Descartes wants to find a firm point from which he can build and trust that all the knowledge that he has is real, something that is not subject to those forms of doubt. And he starts to think, and he realizes that all the things that he thought that he knew, such as, you know, I have hands, I have eyes, I have a head, I go out into the world, I interact with other people, I see the sun, the stars, the moon, all of those things are subject to those three forms of doubt. On the other hand, he does find one thing that he can't doubt. He can't doubt that he is experiencing the sun and the stars and the moon. He can't doubt that he does feel that he has hands and eyes and a head. And so what it comes down to is, in fact, although he can doubt that the objects of all of those sensations and thoughts are real, because of course they could be dreams, they could be the delusions of a mad person, or they could be you know, the hoaxes of a deceiver, you can't doubt that you are experiencing those things. And so this point that he reaches we'll call the cogito. This is Latin, cogito ergo sum. It's usually translated as I think, therefore I am. And you can't doubt that you are thinking. Even if there were a deceiver that was tricking you, if you're there to be tricked, then you are a thinking thing. Even if all the things that you think about in the world are in fact the bedeviling hoaxes of your dreams, that's a quote from Descartes, nonetheless you are dreaming them. And so, although everything else can be called into doubt, this single point, I think, therefore I am, cannot be called into doubt. And this is the foundation that he wants to build his knowledge on. Now, of course, that doesn't get us very far. If this is your starting point and you don't build anything on it, well, then the whole world could just be inside my own head. I think, therefore I am, and there's nothing else. So it's incumbent upon Descartes to build something on this foundation. And so he goes about that by starting to examine his thought. He realizes that he has certain powers of thought. He can affirm and deny, he can will, he can understand. He also says he can sense and he can imagine. And now wait, I thought sense was something that we needed to doubt. Well, again, we can doubt that the objects that we are sensing are real, but we can't doubt that we are sensing. So he starts there, but then he realizes that this thinking thing that is him has the ability to clearly and distinctly perceive things. So I'll write that here. He has the power of clear and distinct perception. And it's important in understanding Descartes to make sure you only use this word, perceive or perception, in this very special sense. And what he means by it is, when you perceive something clearly, you can't shake it with argument. Okay, so for instance, the cogito was his first clear and distinct perception. And if you argue against it, if you say, well, somebody is deceiving you, well, I'm mistaken. Well, if you're there to be mistaken, if something is deceiving you, then you exist. And so the cogito can't be shaken by argument. If something is distinct, then it's not confused with anything else. So let's say not confused. And by that, you know, I don't reach the conclusion that I think, therefore you are, I think, therefore the world is, I think, therefore McDonald's exists. You know, I don't think any of those things. No, I think, therefore I am. I'm not confused about what's being proved by a conclusion like this. And now perception, you know, this sort of specialized thing that we can do. When you perceive something, you grasp the essential features of it with your mind, okay? And that's different than coming to conclusions based on sensation or based on experience. Instead, you're grasping things that are truly essential about a thing. The example that Descartes gives in Meditation 2 is of a piece of wax. And he says, okay, here I have a piece of wax. And I look at it, I touch it, I rap on it, you know, I smell it, and I get all of these sort of sensory features from the piece of wax. You know, it smells floral, it looks white, it sounds hard, it feels cool to the touch. And I might be tempted to think that all of those things are real features of the wax. And of course that's how we go about most of our daily lives. It feels cold outside, you know, I feel hot, you know. Yet, none of these things, Descartes realizes, are actually essential features of the wax. And he demonstrates this by saying, well, I bring the wax closer to the fire. And now the wax starts to change shape. It begins to melt. The floral scent begins to go away. And so, what were those features that I thought were so key to understanding the wax? Well, it wasn't the smell or the texture or the color or the hardness or the sound that it made. None of those things were, in fact, essential features. Those things were only accidents with respect to the wax. You know, so all of those sense features are in fact not essential. But the substance or essence of the wax, he realizes, are things like the fact that it is changeable, mutable, and by mutable he means you can squish it or destroy it, flexible, it can take on a multitude of different forms. You could melt it and turn it into any sort of shape. You could make it a candle, you could make it a toy, you know, you could make it those lips that you put on at Halloween, right? You know, there's all sorts of forms that the wax could take. You could adulterate it with colors. And so he realizes that these are actually the essential features of the wax. But did he realize that with his senses? I mean, the senses may have given him clues because he saw the wax melt and because he realized through his senses that the smell was changing. But it's in his mind that he realizes these essential features, that it is changeable, that it can take on many forms. And so, what did he clearly and distinctly perceive about the wax? Not that it was cold or hard or you know, floral or white or yellow. None of those were essential features. The only things that he clearly and distinctly perceived with his mind were its essences. Changeable, mutable, flexible. And Descartes says that if you are in the act of clearly and distinctly perceiving something, it has to be true. Now wait, you say. I thought there was a deceiver that could be tricking us about each of those things. Well, no. I mean, look, if it's clear and distinct and you are perceiving it, then it can't be wrong. And the cogito, I think, therefore I am, was the first of these clear and distinct perceptions. And the reason it was clear was because there is no argument, even the argument that there is a deceiver, that could be rendering this perception untrue. Now, of course, in our lives, we frequently have, we come to conclusions that we think are clear and distinct perceptions. The example I give my students is, it's summertime in Chicago, and I'm sitting on the grass by the lake, and I see people jogging on the path, and I become very happy because I see what looks like a very attractive woman, with a very nice body, jogging towards me. And it's, oh, I'm very happy about this, right? But then, as this person comes closer, I realize, oh no, it was a guy the whole time, and I feel very, kind of weird and uncomfortable about this, right? Well, if I could be wrong, which I realized that I was, did I actually clearly and distinctly perceive essential features of the jogger? No, in fact, I did not. There are certainly arguments that could be made, say maybe you should wait longer, maybe you should look from all angles, maybe it's a guy with long hair. These are all arguments that would work against the conclusion that I had drawn erroneously. It's also obviously quite confused. It was not distinct that this was a woman. In fact, it turned out to be a man. And I think it's also clear that I didn't perceive essential features of that jogger. The essential gendered nature of the jogger, or the sex characteristics of the jogger. And so I didn't actually clearly and distinctly perceive it. Only if I did do this would it be necessarily true. So the cogito, I think therefore I am, that is necessarily true. I clearly and distinctly perceive it. These features of the wax are necessarily true if wax exists outside of me. Now I haven't gotten there yet because I have not yet shown that there is no deceiver who is just bedeviling my senses with fictitious impulses. So his next step in meditation 3 is to try to show us, number one, that there is a God who is powerful enough to be a deceiver, and then in meditation 4 to show us that this God could not be a deceiver. So how does he do this? Descartes says that he has within him an idea of a God. Okay, he realizes this just by sort of cataloging his thoughts, and this idea of God is a God that is perfect, omnipotent, independent, omniscient, etc. This sort of commonly understood monotheistic spiritual force in the universe. Yes. He realizes he has this idea of a God within him. And so it becomes the task to determine what was the cause of such an idea. Descartes starts with the notion that all causes have at least as much reality or power as the effects that they bring about. And so, for instance, if you had a teapot and had water in it, and you had a fire, if the fire were, say, 400 degrees, the fire is the cause. It's transferring energy or power into the effect, which is the heating of the water. The water is never going to reach 400 degrees. It's always going to be less than or equal to 400 degrees. This is just a metaphorical representation of all causes and all effects. And so ideas, too, have causes. And Descartes says that the cause of an idea must have at least as much reality as the effect, which is the idea itself. If you have an idea in your head, then it must have been caused by something. Now, we have ideas of the sorts of things we see in the world, horses, chairs, whatever, and those things are caused by our having seen a horse or seen a chair. And it's easy to say, at least once we're done with all the meditations, that the real horse has at least as much reality as the idea of horse in my mind. But then also there are ideas of fictitious things, griffins, Harry Potter, Optimus Prime, and you say, well, gee, are they caused by something that has reality? Does Optimus Prime exist? Does a unicorn exist? Well, when you think about it, those ideas in your mind are really just combinations of other things that you've seen, other things that are real. So J.K. Rowling sits down to create Harry Potter, and she combines ideas like boy, magic, monster, boarding school. And so she comes up with something that seems very new, but in fact, that idea has causes that all possess at least as much, if not more, reality or power than the effect, the story of Harry Potter in her mind. And the same goes for Optimus Prime. You have an idea of truck, you have an idea of person, you have an idea of robot, squish, you put those together, Optimus Prime. Well now, and he says this is a clear and distinct perception, that causes have at least as much or more reality than their effects. And so, knowing this, and knowing that he has an idea of God inside him, Descartes says, well, the more carefully I reflect on my own mind, the more I realize that I don't possess any of these perfections. I certainly don't know everything. In fact, my knowledge is increasing every day, which is a perfect indication of the fact that I don't possess all knowledge. I realize that I'm quite dependent. My existence is contingent on my parents, on the earth, continuing to spin around the sun, on all sorts of things. There was a time before which I did not exist. There is going to be a time after which I do not exist. And so I don't seem to have that perfection of perfect independence. I certainly seem to lack powers, and I'm not infinite, and so it seems clear that I don't possess the perfections that this idea of God possesses. And he also rejects the notion that he could have somehow added to finite versions of these things in his mind and just sort of come to the idea of infinitude or perfection or independence by negating ideas of finitude and dependence that he has in his mind. And he says, and I think we can understand why this is. If you're in math class and you're bored, let's say, as I was in most of my math classes, you might take your calculator and do 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1. And you might even stick to it for 30 or 40 minutes, but you never reach infinity. Even if you come back the next day and the next month and the next year, there's not enough time in the universe, even if you lived forever, to keep adding and actually reach any of these, actually infinite features. And so he says, no, it just has to be the case that the idea of God proceeds from something outside of me that actually does contain those perfections. And this is what most philosophers will call the ontological argument for the existence of God. I mean, this is one of two ontological arguments he offers. He's going to offer one later in Meditation 5, which proceeds in a similar sort of manner. He says that he has an idea of God that possesses all of these perfections, and he realizes that it's more perfect to exist than not to exist. And so he comes to the conclusion that if he has an idea of a God who is perfect, it doesn't make any sense for that God to lack a perfection. It would be like imagining a triangle that doesn't have three sides. It's part of the triangle's essence to have three sides. Well, it's part of God's essence to be perfect. And existence, says Descartes, is one of those perfections, and therefore God exists. These are both called ontological arguments because they're based on the being, the kind of being that God is. Whether it's the being that can be the cause of ideas like this in our mind, or the kind of being for whom existence is a part of its essence. So it's an ontological argument. And so, why is he trying to establish that God exists, you might ask? Well, because, if you recall, he wants to eliminate this notion of a deceiver that could be causing us to have phony images and impressions of things in the world. And so, next, in Meditation 4, his task is to show that God could not be a deceiver. We've proved that God exists, but we haven't proved that God isn't a jerk, essentially. And Descartes says, well, okay, I have an idea of God that is perfect. So let's represent that here. God is perfect. But then he also says that deception implies a certain imperfection. Why does he say that? Well, I mean, if you imagine a politician who is lying, I know this is hard to believe, but if you imagine a politician who's lying to you, then you have to come to the conclusion that the politician is hiding something. The politician is weak in some way and is trying to trick you into not recognizing that weakness. And maybe their argument is weak. Maybe they don't have enough money to do what they promise. And the same goes for if you're selling a car to someone. If your car were perfect, would you have to lie about the features of your car to another person in order to get them to buy it? No, you wouldn't. So deception implies imperfection. And so you can see God is not imperfect. God is not deceptive. Deception is incompatible, because if deception is an imperfection and God is defined as a being that contains all perfections, God cannot be deceptive. And so at this point, what's Descartes shown us? We started with reasons for doubt, one of which was deceiver doubt. We started to build sort of an understanding of things based on the features of our own mind, our ability to clearly and distinctly perceive things. Then we clearly and distinctly perceived that God is real. And now we clearly and distinctly perceive that God cannot be a deceiver. And so we've eliminated that class of doubt, deceiver doubt, and we can really start to sort of get outside of our heads. We know we exist, but we also know that God is not deceptive. And therefore, we can start to really understand that there are things outside of us. And in Meditation 6, that's what Descartes does. Descartes says, okay, now I'm going to go back. Since I've built up from a new foundation my understanding of reality, from the cogito to an understanding of God, to an understanding of God's goodness, I start to understand that, I do have impressions of things that come outside. There are things that come to my imagination. And it seems clear that those things are not coming from within me. And he does a very subtle and interesting thing in Meditation 6. He points to the difference between imagination and intellect. And he says, I realize that when I imagine things, it's like conjuring a picture in my mind. So I could imagine a marker very easily. I have a picture of a marker in my mind. I could also imagine, say, 10 chocolates, arranged in a row on the table. That's easy to do. My mind has a very easy time conjuring that image. But if I told you to imagine 10,000 chocolates in a row, or 1 billion chocolates in a row, or 1 trillion chocolates in a row, you'd start to have a very hard time being able to imagine it. Nonetheless, with our minds, our intellects, we can understand what 1 trillion chocolates in a row would be. And sometimes they do this in the newspaper when they try to indicate to you how big $1 trillion is, for instance. It wraps around the moon this many times. I mean, the fact that there needs to be a graphic in the paper is an indication that your imagination is not good enough, not powerful enough to conjure an image of any value of 1 trillion. Yet your mind is capable of it. Certainly the mind of the person who made the graphic was capable of it. And so he realizes that we have these two things in us, and this one is not really essential to our being. Wait, you say you can have a person without an imagination? Well, I mean, if you think about it, there are certainly people who seem to have more imagination or less imagination, and you wouldn't say that the person with less was less of a person. They're just not very interesting, I guess, right? Yet intellect, the ability to understand things with your mind, the ability to understand essential features, if you said that someone was incapable of understanding anything, then you might be willing to say that they're no longer a person, at least not in the sort of meaningful way that we think about people. And so, if this is truly separate from this, and yet we're still receiving things in our imagination that come from our senses, then we can actually take the earlier argument that we used about God, the notion of causes and effects, and we can make sort of an ontological argument for things in the world. And that would be, I have images of things in my mind. Okay, just like before, I had an idea of God in my mind. Yet, these images are not caused by anything essential to me. Only my intellect is essential to me. The images are not essential. Therefore, if there's a cause for every effect, the cause of those images, which are not essential to me, must be outside of me. And so, this is an ontological argument for the existence of things outside of my mind. Because every effect has a cause, and because the cause of the images that I have within me is not essential to my intellect, there must be something that is not a part of my intellect, not a part of that cogito ergo sum, that is the cause of those images, those sense impressions. And now, I might not trust all of the images that I receive with my senses. I might still try to walk all the way around a thing, try to shake it with argument, try to make sure that I'm having a distinct impression of a thing outside me. I will try only to limit my judgments to things that I can clearly and distinctly perceive. But nonetheless, because God is not a deceiver, and so I know that God is not the cause of the images outside me, I can trust that there is a world that is causing the images outside of me. And it's up to me to apply the standard of clear and distinct perception to the world. And if I do that, I should have no reason for falling into error. Errors are my fault. They're not the fault of a deceiver. If I clearly and distinctly perceive, I can actually know things about a world that really does exist outside me. And so, in the meditations, if you recall, the original goal was to find a firm foundation for science, to really be able to trust that there is a world, that I'm not